Margaret Whitmore stood in front of her bedroom mirror, carefully fastening the clasp of her pearl necklace. The soft evening sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting golden streaks across the room. She smoothed the wrinkles from her blue dress and gave herself a small approving nod. Sunday dinners at her son Daniel's house had become the highlight of her week. Ever since her husband Thomas passed away 3 years earlier, the quietness of her home had been difficult to bear. The ticking clock on the living room wall often sounded louder than it should, and the empty chair across the dinner table sometimes made her heart ache. But Sundays were different. On Sundays, the house felt alive again. Daniel would pick her up or insist she drive over, her daughter. In-law Laura would prepare a warm dinner, and her granddaughter Emma would chatter endlessly about school and friends. Those evenings filled a small piece of the emptiness Thomas had left behind. Margaret picked up her purse from the dresser and glanced at the photo frame beside it. It was an old photograph taken nearly 20 years ago. Thomas stood in the middle with his arm around her shoulders, smiling proudly. Daniel, still a teenager back then, stood beside them holding a fishing rod, almost as tall as he was. Thomas had always believed Daniel would grow into a good man. "Take care of your mother when I'm gone," he had once told him jokingly during one of their family trips. Margaret sighed softly at the memory and picked up the photo frame, brushing a finger across Thomas's smiling face. "I'm trying, Tom," she murmured quietly. Just then, her phone buzzed loudly on the dresser. Margaret jumped slightly. She wasn't used to sudden noises anymore. The house had become too quiet over the years. She reached for the phone and adjusted her glasses before reading the message. It was from Mr. Carter *, her lawyer. The message was short. Call me immediately. Margaret frowned. That was strange. Mr. Carter rarely texted her, and when he did, it was usually about routine matters, paperwork for the trust Thomas had set up before he died, or reminders about annual reviews. But this message felt different. Something about the urgency in those 3 words made her chest tighten. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen. Then she tapped his number and lifted the phone to her ear. It rang twice before he answered. "Margaret." His voice sounded unusually serious. "Yes, it's me. I just got your message. Is everything all right?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I hope so," he finally said. Margaret's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "Well, I need to ask you something important. Did you recently give your son Daniel permission to access your trust documents?" Margaret blinked in confusion. "No," she replied immediately. "Of course not. Why would I do that?" Another silence followed. Longer this time. When Mr. Carter spoke again, his tone carried a weight that made Margaret grip the phone tighter. "That's concerning," he said slowly. Margaret felt a chill creep down her spine. "Concerning how?" "Because earlier today Daniel and his wife Laura came to my office." Margaret's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "They did?" "Yes," Mr. Carter replied. "They told my assistant you had asked them to handle some estate matters for you." Margaret laughed nervously. "That doesn't sound like something I would do without telling you first. That's exactly why I'm calling." The air in Margaret's bedroom suddenly felt heavier. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Mr. Carter exhaled. "They brought paperwork, documents requesting the transfer of your house and a large portion of your savings into Daniel's name." Margaret's heart skipped. "My house, yes." She glanced around the bedroom, the same room she and Thomas had shared for more than 40 years. The pale yellow walls, the antique dresser Thomas had restored himself, the soft creak of the wooden floorboards. This house wasn't just property. It was her life. "But that's impossible," she whispered. "I never signed anything like that." Another pause. "Margaret," Mr. Carter said gently, "that's what worries me." Her throat tightened. "Why?" "Because the documents they brought were signed." Margaret's fingers trembled slightly against the phone. "Signed by who? You?" For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. That can't be right," she said finally. "I would remember signing something like that." "I thought so too," Mr. Carter replied. "But the signature looks very convincing." Margaret sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. Her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe Daniel misunderstood something. Maybe Laura had confused some paperwork. There had to be an explanation. My son wouldn't do something like that, she said quietly, more to herself than to the lawyer. Mr. Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he said something that made Margaret's blood run cold. "There's something else." Her grip on the phone tightened again. "What is it?" They seemed very confident that everything was already approved. Margaret's pulse quickened. "They said you had personally signed the transfer forms 2 weeks ago." Her eyes widened. 2 weeks ago, she repeated. Yes, 2 weeks ago. She had been home almost the entire time, organizing old photo albums and attending Emma's school recital. She hadn't visited the law office, she hadn't signed anything, and she certainly hadn't agreed to give away her house. A heavy silence filled the line. Then Margaret asked the question that had begun forming in her mind. "Did you approve the documents?" "No," Mr. Carter answered firmly. "Something didn't feel right, so I told them I needed to confirm with you first." Relief and dread washed over Margaret at the same time. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Margaret," he continued gently, "I think we need to meet tomorrow morning and look at these papers together." She nodded even though he couldn't see her. Yes, that would be best. After they ended the call, Margaret sat there for several minutes staring at the floor. Her phone still rested in her hand. The room suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if something invisible had shifted. Finally, she stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sky had begun turning shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped toward the horizon. In less than an hour, she was supposed to be at Daniel's house for dinner. She imagined his warm smile as he opened the door. The hug Emma would give her, the comfortable sound of family conversation around the table, but now a single unsettling thought echoed in her mind. Why would Daniel go to my lawyer without telling me? Margaret slowly picked up her purse again. Her hands felt colder than before. Something deep inside her told her that tonight's dinner might not feel the same as all the others, because for the first time in her life, Margaret was beginning to wonder if she truly knew her own son at all. And she had a terrible feeling that tomorrow morning, when she finally saw those documents, everything she believed about her family might change forever. Margaret sat in her car outside Daniel's house for several minutes before getting out. The familiar brick home stood quietly under the soft glow of the porch light. Through the living room window, she could see shadows moving and hear faint laughter. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Warm, peaceful, normal. But Margaret's heart felt heavier than it had in years. Her conversation with Mr. Carter kept replaying in her mind like a broken record. They brought signed paperwork. The signature looks very convincing. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. No, she whispered to herself, there must be some misunderstanding. Daniel wasn't that kind of person. He was her son, the little boy who used to run into her arms after school, the teenager who helped his father repair the old fence in the backyard, the man who hugged her tightly at Thomas's funeral and promised, I'll always take care of you, Mom. Margaret slowly stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Grandma, Emma's excited voice filled the air as the old launched herself into Margaret's arms. Margaret immediately smiled, hugging her tightly. Well, hello there, sweetheart, she said warmly. Emma pulled back, grinning. Mom made your favorite roast chicken. Margaret glanced past her into the house. Daniel stood in the hallway, smiling. Hey, Mom, he said, walking over to hug her. You look great. His arms wrapped around her shoulders in the same familiar way they always had. But tonight something felt different. Margaret couldn't quite explain it. Maybe it was the stiffness in his voice. Or maybe it was simply the echo of her lawyer's words in her mind. Thank you, dear, she replied gently. Laura appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Margaret, perfect timing. Dinner is almost ready. The smell of roasted chicken, garlic, and fresh bread filled the house. Everything looked normal, too normal. Margaret hung her coat on the rack and joined them in the dining room. The table was already set beautifully with white plates and neatly folded napkins. They all sat down together. Emma talked excitedly about a school project involving planets, waving her fork around as she described Saturn's rings. Margaret smiled and listened, nodding occasionally, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Every now and then she glanced at Daniel. He seemed relaxed, joking with Emma and asking Laura about work. If he was nervous about anything, he hid it well. Margaret took a slow sip of water and decided to test something. "Oh," she said casually, "I spoke with Mr. Carter today. The reaction was immediate." Daniel's fork clattered softly against his plate, just for a split second, but Margaret noticed. His eyes flickered toward her. "Really?" he asked, forcing a small smile. "Yes," Margaret replied calmly. "He mentioned you stopped by his office earlier." The air around the table seemed to tighten. Laura spoke quickly before Daniel could respond. "Oh, that. Yes, we did." Margaret turned to her. "You did?" Laura nodded cheerfully. "We were just helping organize some paperwork for you, estate planning and things like that." Daniel quickly added, "You know, just making sure everything is taken care of for the future." Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap. "That's thoughtful," she said softly, but inside, her chest felt hollow. Because Daniel wasn't looking at her. He was staring down at his plate. Emma, unaware of the tension, continued talking happily. But Margaret noticed something else now. Laura kept glancing at Daniel, as if silently asking him to stay calm. Margaret decided to press a little further. "So what kind of paperwork were you looking at?" she asked. Daniel cleared his throat. "Oh, nothing serious. Just checking the trust documents." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "That's strange," she said. Both of them looked at her. "Why?" Daniel asked. "Because I don't remember asking anyone to do that." The room fell quiet. Only the soft clinking of Emma's fork against her plate could be heard. Laura forced a laugh. "Well, we just thought it would be easier to handle things now instead of later." Margaret gave a polite smile. "That's very considerate." But she saw the quick flash of relief in Daniel's eyes when the conversation moved on. Dinner continued. Emma showed Margaret drawings from school. Laura talked about a coworker who had quit suddenly. Daniel laughed at a story about a neighbor's dog chasing the mailman. To anyone watching, it looked like a perfectly happy family dinner. But Margaret now saw something she had never noticed before. Daniel and Laura exchanged quick glances whenever she spoke. Their smiles seemed just a little too practiced, their laughter a little too quick. By the time dessert arrived, Margaret's earlier hope had begun to fade. Because deep down she already knew the truth. Something wasn't right. After dinner, Daniel walked her to the door as he always did. "Drive safe, Mom," he said. Margaret looked at him carefully. His face looked the same eyes. The same smile. But suddenly she felt as if she were looking at a stranger. "You too, dear," she replied gently. When she reached her car, she didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, she sat there staring at the house. Inside, she could see Emma running around the living room. Daniel and Laura stood in the kitchen talking quietly. Margaret's heart felt heavy. The drive home felt longer than usual. When she finally arrived, the house greeted her with its familiar silence. She placed her purse on the table and slowly sat down on the couch. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Her eyes drifted to the photo of Thomas again. "I think something's wrong," she whispered to the empty room. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Mr. Carter's office. He greeted her with a serious expression and led her into his office. Several documents lay neatly arranged on the desk. He slid one of them toward her. "Take a look," he said gently. Margaret adjusted her glasses and lowered her gaze to the page. At first glance, everything looked official. Legal language, proper formatting, but then she saw it. Her name, and beneath it her signature. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, because it looked exactly like her handwriting. Every curve, every letter. Perfect, but she knew the truth. She had ***, never signed it ***. Her hands began to tremble. "Someone forged this," she whispered. Mr. Carter nodded slowly. "That's what I believe." Margaret stared at the paper, her mind racing. Only a few people would benefit from this transfer. Only a few people knew about her trust, and only 2 people had visited the lawyer's office yesterday. Daniel and Laura. For a moment, Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes, but then something unexpected happened. The tears never fell. Instead, a calm determination settled over her. She carefully placed the document back on the desk. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Mr. Carter studied her. "We could file a fraud report immediately." Margaret thought about Daniel's forced smile at dinner, about Laura's nervous laugh, about the signature staring back at her from the page. Slowly, she shook her head. "Not yet." The lawyer looked surprised. "You want to wait?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." A strange calmness filled her voice. "Let them believe everything is working." Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, and then Margaret's eyes hardened in a way they hadn't in years. "Then," she said quietly, "we make sure they regret it." For the first time since Thomas died, Margaret felt something awakening inside her. Not grief, not sadness, but something far stronger, a plan. The morning after Margaret discovered the forged documents, something inside her changed. The fragile, grieving widow everyone believed her to be quietly disappeared. In her place stood a woman who had spent 40 years building a life beside a hard-working husband, raising a child, managing finances, and surviving heartbreak. Margaret Whitmore was not weak, and now she was wide awake. She sat across from Mr. Carter in his office, the forged document lying between them like a silent accusation. "Are you absolutely certain you want to wait?" Mr. Carter asked carefully. "Forgery is a serious crime. We could contact the authorities today." Margaret gently folded her hands on the desk. "If we accuse them now," she said calmly, "they'll deny everything." "That's possible," Mr. Carter admitted. "And if they realize the plan failed," Margaret continued, "they'll become more careful." Mr. Carter watched her closely. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret leaned back slightly. "Let them believe their plan is working." For a moment the lawyer said nothing. Then a slow smile appeared. "I see." Margaret gave a small nod. "They think I'm old, forgetful, easy to manipulate." She paused. "Let them keep believing that." Mr. Carter picked up a pen. "In that case, we should move quickly." Over the next few weeks, Margaret played her role perfectly. Every Sunday, she arrived at Daniel's house for dinner, just like always. She brought home made pies. She laughed at Emma's stories. She complimented Laura's cooking. If Daniel felt guilty, he hid it well. But Margaret began noticing subtle changes. He asked more questions about her finances. "How's the house maintenance going?" he asked one evening. "Oh, it's fine," Margaret replied with a gentle smile. Another time Laura asked casually, "Have you thought about downsizing? A big house must be hard to manage alone." Margaret simply nodded thoughtfully. "I'll think about it." But while Daniel and Laura believed their plan was quietly progressing, Margaret was moving much faster. Within days, Mr. Carter helped her establish a **, new protected trust **, that Daniel had no knowledge of. Every asset she owned was transferred: her house, her savings, her late husband's investment accounts. Even a small vacation property Thomas had bought years ago that Daniel had completely forgotten about. Everything was placed safely beyond Daniel's reach. The forged documents were now completely useless. But Margaret wasn't finished. One afternoon she sat in Mr. Carter's office reviewing another set of papers. "These are the documents for the foundation," he explained. Margaret read through them slowly. "The **, Thomas Whitmore Scholarship Foundation, **. It would help students from struggling families attend college. Thomas had always believed education could change lives." Margaret smiled softly. "He would have liked this," she said. Mr. Carter nodded. "And you're sure about the amount?" Margaret didn't hesitate. Yes, nearly 70% of her estate would go to the foundation. Another portion would support local charities. Mr. Carter looked at her carefully. "And Daniel?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. The image of her son as a little boy flashed briefly through her mind. sticky fingers after eating ice cream, running through the backyard with a kite, laughing beside his father during fishing trips. Her chest tightened slightly, but then she remembered the forged signature, the lies, the secret visit to the lawyer, and the quiet calculations behind Daniel's smile. Her expression hardened. "I'll take care of Daniel," she said calmly. A few days later, Margaret invited the entire family to dinner at her house. It had been a long time since she hosted. Daniel sounded surprised when she called. "Dinner at your place?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret replied warmly. "I have some wonderful news I'd like to share." On the other end of the phone, Daniel hesitated for just a moment. Then his voice brightened. "That sounds great, Mom." Laura sounded equally enthusiastic when she heard. "Oh, Margaret, that's lovely. We'll bring dessert." But Margaret could already imagine what they were really thinking. They believed the forged documents were slowly pushing things in their favor. They believed her house would soon belong to them. They believed she was simply an old woman preparing her inheritance. And that belief made the trap even sweeter. The evening of the dinner arrived. Margaret spent the afternoon cooking, the same meals Thomas used to love. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread. As she set the table, she glanced around the dining room. This house had seen decades of memories, birthdays, Christmas mornings, family celebrations. It deserved a better legacy than betrayal. At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Emma ran inside first, hugging Margaret tightly. "Grandma, it smells amazing." Daniel and Laura followed behind her. Daniel looked around the house curiously. "You've been busy," he said. Margaret smiled. "Oh, just a little organizing." Dinner was warm and lively. Emma talked endlessly about a school play she would perform in next month. Laura complimented the food. Daniel laughed and poured wine. To any outsider, it looked like a loving family enjoying a peaceful evening. But Margaret watched carefully. She noticed how Daniel's eyes occasionally scanned the house, the living room, the furniture, the staircase, as if he were already imagining it as his. Margaret felt a strange calmness settle inside her. Soon, very soon, when dessert was finished, Margaret slowly stood up. "I have something I'd like to share with all of you," she said. "Die President's ANIEL Avoy." Ed straightened in his chair. Laura leaned forward slightly. Margaret walked to a small cabinet near the wall and picked up a neatly prepared folder. Inside were several documents, the final pieces of her plan. She returned to the table and placed the folder gently in front of Daniel. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," she said softly. Daniel's face brightened. Laura held her breath. Margaret opened the folder, and in that quiet moment, she knew something Daniel and Laura didn't. Their plan was about to collapse, and neither of them saw it coming. The room was quiet as Margaret placed the folder on the dining table. The soft ticking of the wall clock echoed through the house. Daniel leaned forward, curiosity and excitement flickering across his face. Laura sat beside him, trying to appear calm, but Margaret could see the anticipation in her eyes. They were expecting good news. Margaret folded her hands gently on the table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she began softly. "About the future, about this house, and about what should happen when I'm gone." Daniel nodded quickly. "That's smart, Mom. Planning ahead is important." Margaret gave a faint smile. "Yes, it is." She slowly opened the folder and slid the first document across the table toward him. Daniel picked it up. At first, his expression remained confident, but as his eyes moved across the page, something changed. The confidence faded. His forehead creased. "Wait, what is this?" he asked. Laura leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. Margaret remained calm. "It's the official paperwork for a charitable foundation." Daniel blinked. "A foundation?" Margaret nodded. "The Thomas Whitmore Scholarship Foundation, in your father's name." Laura's eyes widened slightly. Daniel quickly flipped through the next pages. 70%, he said, his voice rising slightly. "You're giving 70% of everything to charity." Margaret nodded again. "Yes." The room fell silent. Emma looked back and forth between the adults, sensing something strange but not understanding. Daniel set the papers down slowly. "But what about the house?" he asked carefully. Margaret slid another document toward him. Daniel picked it up. This time his face turned pale almost immediately. The house, the savings, the investment accounts, all transferred not to him, not to Laura, but to the foundation and several charities. Daniel's hands trembled slightly. This doesn't make sense," he said. Laura's voice came out sharp. "Margaret, we talked about this. You said you trusted Daniel to handle things." Margaret looked at her calmly. "Did I?" Laura hesitated. "Well, not exactly like that, but—" Daniel suddenly looked up. "Mom, the paperwork we brought to your lawyer." Margaret raised her hand. And Daniel stopped speaking. Her calm expression had changed. For the first time that evening, her eyes looked cold. "Yes," she said quietly. "Let's talk about that paperwork." Daniel's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" Margaret slowly pulled another document from the folder. This one she placed directly in front of him. Daniel stared at it. Then his face drained of color. It was a copy of the forged transfer document. With her signature, or rather the signature someone had tried very hard to imitate. "You forged my name," Margaret said softly. Emma looked confused. "Dad." Daniel immediately shook his head. "No, that's not what happened." Laura jumped in quickly. "There must be some misunderstanding. Maybe someone at the office made a mistake." Margaret gently tapped the paper with one finger. "The handwriting expert disagrees." The room went completely still. Daniel looked up sharply. "What?" Margaret reached into the folder one final time. She removed another sheet, a legal notice, and slid it across the table. Daniel stared at the document. His hands began to shake more visibly. "Mom," he whispered. Margaret's voice remained calm. "This morning, Mr. Carter filed a report for fraud and forgery." Laura gasped. "You called the police?" Margaret looked at her. "No," she replied quietly. "I called the law." Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. "You can't do this," he said desperately. "I'm your son." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. And in that moment she saw both versions of him, the little boy who used to hold her hand, and the man who had tried to steal everything she owned. "You stopped being my son," she said softly, "the moment you decided to steal from me." Daniel's eyes filled with panic. "I wasn't stealing, I was just planning ahead." Margaret finished. Laura stood up angrily. "This is ridiculous. Families share assets all the time." Margaret's gaze shifted to her. "Families also tell the truth." Laura opened her mouth but said nothing. Margaret slowly stood from the table. For a moment no one spoke. Then she picked up her coat from the chair beside her. Emma's small voice broke the silence. "Grandma, are you leaving?" Margaret's expression softened immediately. She walked over and hugged the little girl gently. "Yes, sweetheart, but I'll see you soon." Daniel looked stunned. "You're just walking away." Margaret turned toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back at him one last time. "You thought I was helpless," she said quietly. "You thought I wouldn't notice." She opened the door. The cool night air rushed inside, but you forgot something. Daniel stared at her. Margaret's voice was steady. "I may be old, but I'm not foolish." She stepped outside and closed the door behind her. For the first time in years, the weight in her chest felt lighter. The betrayal still hurt, but the truth had been spoken. And justice had already begun. As Margaret walked toward her car beneath the quiet glow of the streetlights, she felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Peace, because sometimes the sweetest revenge wasn't anger. It was simply refusing to let someone take what they never deserved.